Voters in 3 states in the District of Columbia marked ballots today in the biggest primary day of Campaign 72. The voting in the Capitol and in Alabama involved convention delegates unpledged to any candidate, although in some instances favoring one or the other. So the interest centered on Indiana and Ohio. Ohio has evolved essentially into a race between Hubert Humphrey and George McGovern. The count will be slowed there by a voting machine problem in the Cleveland area, which has resulted in a federal court order keeping polls open until midnight. That Cuyahoga County area accounts for some 20% or more of the Ohio vote. In Indiana, Edmund Muskie's name remained on the ballot, but the race was between Humphrey and George Wallace. We have a report from Bill Curtis.
George Wallace has been driving hard in Indiana, and although he predicts victory in the state's primary tonight, he's just a little nervous.
Take it easy now, we've got it. I showed you just how to do it.
In the final push to the wire, there is more worrying George Wallace than his wife's driving, for Hubert Humphrey is closing fast. With Ed Muskie out of contention and George McGovern's name not on the ballot, it's Wallace and Humphrey head-to-head. Wallace is concentrated on this state to cultivate the support he senses among Indiana's 600,000 union members. His speeches haven't changed much. The issues here provide the same fertile ground for a Wallace appeal. High emotions over busing, rising taxes, a protest vote of the working man, and the claim that he said it all first.
And in '68, I said that. Not a one of them said it. Have you noticed Mr. Humphrey and Mr. McGovern and all of them talking about, if you elect me president, I'm going to reduce your taxes. I'm going to sponsor bills that'll give tax relief and tax reform. Well, why didn't they introduce those bills? Mr. Humphrey's been in the Senate 24 years, and the House 24 years. Why didn't he introduce a bill 24 years ago?
The Indiana primary will be a test of labor strength. The Wallace blue-collar workers against Humphrey's traditional endorsements by the union leadership. But the question remains in Indiana, will Humphrey's traditional labor support hold up among the rank and file? In the week before the primary, union leaders began to turn the organization into gear for Humphrey. Leaflets went out to members. Volunteers went door to door offering rides to the polls.
These are invitations to the Humphrey rally for Senator Humphrey, and this is another invitation for another rally.
And there were other tactics directed against Wallace. This is a 5-minute political message reportedly produced by regular Democratic labor supporters.
When Wallace got the vote, Nixon got the White House. It wasn't meant to be that way, but a lot of people got fooled.
The spot ran daily last week, blaming Wallace for electing Richard Nixon, and it blamed Richard Nixon for unemployment. George Wallace didn't like it.
Many of the things said about us have been distorted. And you've had some ads on television and in the newspapers that are just as erroneous and untrue as anything that I've ever heard of.
But Hubert Humphrey made sure others heard of it.
A vote for Wallace is a vote for Nixon.
That's right.
Wallace brags. Listen to this. Wallace brags he put Nixon in the White House. Dear friends, it may not have been, in your mind, the worst thing that I was defeated. But let me tell you something, the worst possible thing that could happen to you is that Richard Nixon was elected. And Mr. Wallace admits that he was responsible for it.
Senator Humphrey bounced back and forth between Indiana and Ohio, entering both primaries, and state Democratic leaders fear he may have weakened both races by spreading himself and his staff too thin. But the race has been extremely close. Labor will make the difference for both candidates. With the choice of Humphrey or Wallace, no one needs to guess where the black votes will go. Only 76 delegate votes are at stake in Indiana, and Hubert Humphrey maintains a loss here would not be fatal to his campaign. But a Wallace win would be embarrassing and significant as the first major Wallace victory in a primary north of the Mason-Dixon line. Bill Curtis, CBS News, near Indianapolis.
CBS News coverage of the primary election returns will continue throughout the evening with a special broadcast scheduled for 10:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 9:30 Central. 17 Republican governors wrapped up a 2-day conference at White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. In the final hours, they adopted a resolution praising President Nixon's foreign and domestic policies and pledged to work for the re-election of Mr. Nixon and Vice President Agnew.